To make this lucky star block, you will need to cut 1 4.5 inch square and 8 2.5 inch squares from a print fabric, 4 2.5 by 4.5 inch rectangles, 4 2.5 inch squares, and then 8 4.5 inch squares from a white solid fabric. Then lastly, 4 4.5 by 8.5 inch rectangles and 4 4.5 inch squares from a matching solid fabric. To begin, mark a diagonal line on the back of each of the 2.5 inch print squares with a pencil and ruler. Place a marked square on top of a 2.5 by 4.5 inch white rectangle, right sides together, with the pencil line running from the center down to the left hand corner. Pin it evenly into place and then at the sewing machine, sew on top of the pencil line from one corner to the other. With a ruler and blade, trim the corner off, leaving behind a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then press the triangle corner open with a medium to hot steamy iron. Lay another square face down on the opposite side of the rectangle piece, with the marked line running from the center down to the right hand corner. Pin evenly into place and then sew again on top of the marked line from one corner to the other. Trim off the excess corner, leaving behind a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then press the corner out. From here, repeat the same steps to make 4 of the same flying geese units, and then another 4 using the 4 4.5 by 8.5 grey solid rectangles and the 8 4.5 inch white solid squares. Next, lay out the 4.5 inch center square along with the 4 smaller flying geese units and the 4 2.5 inch white solid squares. Flip one flying geese unit onto the center square and pin it evenly into place. Then repeat the same step with the opposite side. Sew a 1/4 inch seam along one pinned edge and then turn it around and sew down the other side. With the iron, press each of these seams inwards towards the center square. Next, turn one of the top row corner squares onto the flying geese unit and pin it into place. Then do the same with the other. Sew a 1/4 inch seam along both of the pinned edges and then press the seams outwards towards the corner squares. After piecing the bottom row of units together in the same way, flip the top row over onto the middle row. Nest the seams together and then pin into place. Sew a 1/4 inch seam down this edge and then gently press the seam inwards towards the center of the block. Then do the same with the other row to complete this section of the block. Next, lay out the 4 bigger flying geese units and the 4.5 inch squares around the center star block. Turn one of the flying geese units over onto the center block and pin it evenly into place. Then do the same with the opposite unit. Carefully sew a 1/4 inch seam along either edge and then gently press the seam inwards towards the center of the block. Turn one of the top row squares over onto the flying geese unit and pin it into place. Then do the same with the opposite corner square. Sew a 1/4 inch seam along both of the pinned sides and then press the seams outwards towards the corner squares. Once you've pieced the bottom row of units together in the same way, turn the top row over onto the center and evenly nest and pin the top edge together. Slowly sew a 1/4 inch seam along this side and then gently press the seam outwards towards the top row of the block. Then, to complete the block, repeat the same steps to piece on the last row of the block. Once finished and trimmed, the block measures approximately 16.5 inches square.